Hello class! Today we'd like to share with you the facade design pattern. This is particularly useful for large-scale projects and will be very helpful as we are creating the SDD for the rest of this semester. A general conceptual overview of facade is in this image here on the left. So the client or our users will interact with the facade, and the facade then forwards the requests and the operations to the subsystem that actually carries out those operations. On the right, you can see this pattern hides all the complexity of one or more classes behind a clean, well-lit facade. The user isn't really interested in how things get done with the software. They just want to say, here, do it, and the complexity should be hidden from them. The facade helps with that. It unifies different interfaces in a subsystem. It's that collection of interfaces just for creating one access point for the user to interact with. The facade pattern allows us to avoid tight coupling between clients and subsystems, which is very important from a programming standpoint. We'll look more at that with an illustration on the next page. The facade layer type provides the functionality of forwarding messages to objects that are part of the subsystem. A really good illustration of this is on the right. So on the top, we can see where there are lots of client classes and operations that can be done, but there's very tight coupling between classes C1, C2, and C3 and the rest of the system. The subsystem classes there outlined in gray. However, below that, when a facade pattern is used, it creates that collection of interfaces and makes one high-level contact point with the client. All of the requests are made to the facade from the client. The facade then decides where to send those directives, forwards those messages to the relevant areas of the subsystem, and has the complexity of the subsystem hidden from the client classes and decouples the client from the subsystem. In this way, it can be a very important separation point to separate concerns.
We could apply the facade pattern to our search feature of our project. The facade would sit between the client and the potential classes that run the search feature. The facade could be a simple interface that the client interacts with. This would help make it so it is not as confusing for the client, but it would still allow for them to be able to access all of the options the search feature has, like the filters, autocomplete, and advanced features. If we gave all of these options up front, without a facade in between, the user could quickly become overwhelmed and give up using the app.
So this design pattern does have several upsides to it. First of all, it simplifies a complex system. When designers are building a system, it can quickly become filled with all these different classes, objects, moving parts. All these things can come together and make a really complex, hard to use system for the client. So what this design pattern aims to do is to take all these things and put them into a simplified interface that the client has an easier time working with and using. The design pattern is fairly straightforward, so it doesn't require a lot of in-depth knowledge. It's fairly simple to grasp. It can add in its own smarts. So for an example, a movie theater, if there's a popcorn popper, it knows that the popcorn popper needs to be on before actually popping popcorn. It also helps to avoid tight coupling between the clients and objects in the subsystem. When you see the clients and the objects interacting, they can quickly become intertwined and really dependent on one another. And that just helps to reduce all those dependencies and make it so that there's just a simplified interface that can be accessed. And this last bullet point kind of goes along with that. It reduces dependencies of external code on the inner workings of the libraries. So all of its in-depth knowledge about the libraries doesn't need to be known. It just has its simple interface I can access. Its design pattern doesn't have a lot of downsides, but one of them is that every time the subsystem methods are updated, that the facade layer also needs to be updated. So that means it requires a little extra work out of the developers, but in the end, it's worth it to provide a clean, simple interface for the client to use.
Hello, I'm Ankita, and I'm going to talk about the recommendations and when to use the facade design pattern. Let's say you have a really complex system and you don't want all of that to expose to your client. So in this case, you would want to use the facade design pattern to show this system in a simplified way. Facade design pattern makes really large APIs and libraries easier to use for the user, which are good for maintenance and readability. Another case where you would want to use the facade design pattern is when you want to reduce dependencies, code on the inner working of the libraries, and for providing flexibility. Here's another great scenario. So when you have multiple methods in your subsystem and you only want to provide access to a few methods that are needed through a high-level interface, then you would want to use a facade design pattern. And here are our sources and references.